The Battle of Puketakere and its one-sided result would lead to significant changes on both sides of the conflict. Maori seem to have been surprised at the scale and ease of their victory. Tamati Ngāporta is quoted as saying that the natives engaged in the conflict at Puketakere expressed their great astonishment at the mode of warfare adopted by the military, by which they continually exposed themselves to great loss, though vastly superior in numbers to the natives. He says, "Why are not soldiers taught to fight after the native fashion? They cannot help being beaten if they continue to fight as if they were fighting Pākehās. The natives admire their personal courage, but say that it is this that causes their destruction, for they move so steadily and so close that one bullet kills 2 men." After this battle, Maori warriors from a number of iwi travelled to Waitara to join Kingi. Ngāti Maniapoto were probably the most numerous, but significant numbers would come from the other Waikato iwi, as well as Ngāti Hawa and even Ngāti Raukawa and Ngāti Tuwharetoa. Eventually, about 800 Maori from these iwi would fight alongside Te Atiawa, significantly strengthening their forces. For the Pākehā, this defeat further damaged the reputation of the British Army. The first significant impact of the battle was that Major General Pratt took command of the war. An experienced soldier, he had fought in the final years of the Napoleonic Wars and commanded soldiers during the First Opium War against China. He was the commander of all the British forces in Australasia, and the conflict in Taranaki was now significant enough that he was asked to take personal command of the forces there. Before his arrival at the start of August, hundreds more soldiers arrived at New Plymouth. However, the Maori forces maintained pressure on the government forces at Waitara. The pā at Puketakere was strengthened and smaller outposts were constructed closer to the army camp at Waitara. However, Major Nelson was sent some 8-inch naval guns, and with these he was able to fire on the pā from the safety of the British camp. Whenever Maori came too close to the camp, the artillery fired a few shots, and this was sufficient to prevent the Maori from attacking the British forces. There were a number of skirmishes between Waitara and New Plymouth, as Maori began pillaging settler farms around the Bell Block. The only casualty was an unarmed settler who was shot twice as he was collecting driftwood from a beach. In the west, Taranaki and Ngāti Ruanui had occupied Te Tauromaka and began cautiously advancing towards New Plymouth. However, they did also put a lot of effort in preparing the fields they had captured for the spring planting. For their part, the government forces focused on strengthening their defences around New Plymouth and evacuating even more civilians out of the town. Disease was becoming a serious issue for both sides. Influenza was reaching epidemic levels in Maori communities at this time. It killed the Maori King Potato Te Wherewhere and some participants of the Kohimarama conference, but was particularly deadly in Taranaki, where the destruction caused by the raiding forced hungry people into crowded and unsanitary conditions. Pratt's arrival on the 3rd of August coincided with the arrival of Taranaki and Ngāti Ruanui near Waireka. On the 2nd, they had ambushed a mixed hunting party of soldiers and civilians, killing one of each. Over the following weeks, skirmishes became an almost daily occurrence to both the east and west as patrols from both sides encountered each other. Both sides focused on the economic aspect of the war, removing livestock and valuables from the abandoned farms and preventing their opponents from doing so. Later in the month, a ship preparing to take refugees to Nelson was driven onto Hanui Beach in a storm. This ship became a focal point for fighting, as it was between the New Plymouth defences and the Bell Block stockade. The crew were evacuated safely, and a party of government soldiers secured it first and was able to remove valuables from the ship. However, at night Maori were able to close in the ship and fire on it. One man was killed when he strayed too far from the ship at night, but those Maori that had failed to secure the wreck of the ship did burn a number of farms and take a lot of livestock from the nearby farms. At this time, the Western Front was where most of the fighting was happening. The colonial forces still occupied the stockade at Omata, and had built a camp on the site of Kaipopo Pā. Taranaki and Ngāti Ruanui began putting heavy pressure on this camp. They entrenched positions in the gullies near the camp, and skirmishing forces that were sent out to drive them off were unsuccessful. The camp was belatedly entrenched and reinforced, but most days and nights the Maori warriors advanced close enough to the camp to fire on its defences, as well as burning nearby buildings and expanding their own entrenchments. Every building outside of gunshot from the Omata stockade or camp was destroyed, and it seemed like the camp would eventually be surrounded if nothing was done. However, By the end of August, the Maori had withdrawn from the vicinity of the camp. Settlers attributed this withdrawal to a freak bullet killing a senior chief at extremely long range, but it is far more likely that a large portion of the Maori forces had to leave the front lines due to the need to plant spring crops, and because of the flu epidemic. At the same time, the Puketaki Pa was abandoned, and the raiders around the Bell Block also suddenly withdrew. Major Nelson at Waitara took this opportunity to destroy 4 pa near Waitara. Pratt had been given a reprieve from what had been a poor showing in his first month in command in New Zealand. The sole event that could really be called a success for Pratt was a skirmish where a large group of Taranaki and Ngāti Rurunui had come too close to New Plymouth, and a few hundred soldiers rushed out to chase them off, killing 1 Maori in the process. However, when the soldiers withdrew to the New Plymouth fortifications, they were followed by the raiding party, who burnt some farms within sight of the walls of New Plymouth. Pratt was looking for greater success in September. In the west, the Maori forces that had retreated from Waireka were fortifying themselves a few kilometres distant at Barton's Hill. On the 4th of September, Pratt marched with about 750 soldiers to surround and attack this hill. But after a long march, they found that the hill had been abandoned. Lieutenant Colonel Carey wrote that there was still warm food found on the hill, suggesting that they had just missed the defenders. The colonial forces burnt the nearby pa of Ratapihipihi and withdrew. 5 days later, Pratt attacked in the opposite direction and led a large number of soldiers, Cowan says 1,400, Carey says 1,150, to the Waitara. They had received information that Te Atiawa had withdrawn to the 3 pa, Ngāti Parirua, Kairau and Huirangi, and would fight to defend them. However, the first 2 were destroyed without opposition. When reaching Huirangi, the British forces began burning the pa when they were fired on from the nearby forest. The Maori forces were significantly outnumbered. Hapurona was reported as being in command of possibly as few as 30 warriors, but they were in prepared positions in thick cover. A group of British soldiers entered the forest, but became separated from each other, and 1 man was killed while the rest escaped. The smoke from the burning pa obscured both sides' view of the engagement, and the colonial soldiers were ordered to remain at a distance from the Maori and use their artillery and rockets to try and inflict casualties. With the pa destroyed, the colonial force withdrew, and, as the Taranaki Herald reported it, much dissatisfied with our day's work. The soldiers and settlers were irked that an overwhelming colonial force had been engaged by a much smaller Maori force, and the colonials had withdrawn without seriously attempting to defeat Hapurona and his warriors. Contemporary reports put the losses as being roughly even, 1 dead and a few wounded for each side. However, in a strategic sense, the colonists should have viewed this operation favourably. They had destroyed 3 pa and captured a large quantity of livestock. They also took the opportunity to build a redoubt on the side of Puketaki to prevent Te Atiawa from reoccupying this position. The initiative was now firmly behind the colonial forces, and their next move was again an expedition to the west. A reconnaissance in force was sent to the Tairomaka block with orders to scout out as far as the Kaihihi River. 600 soldiers led by Major Hutchins from the 12th Regiment over a few days occupied the Tairomaka and destroyed Maori fortifications, and discovered that Taranaki had built a significant fortifications on the Kaihihi River to protect the agricultural lands of the iwi. September went the way of the British to a much greater extent than August had, but the month ended with a successful ambush at Waitara, which killed 4 British soldiers, showing that even though a large number of Maori warriors had left the war zone to tend to their crops, they still had the ability to inflict damage on the colonial forces. In October, Pratt planned to destroy the Taranaki positions on the Kaihihi River and raid deep into Taranaki territory. However, poor weather kept the army at New Plymouth until the 9th, when Pratt led a force of 761 British soldiers, 76 militia, 150 Allied Maori, an 8-inch cannon, 3 24-pounders, 2 12-pounders and a 6-pounder howitzer to Kaihihi. Here they found Taranaki in 3 pa. Orongamai Hangai on the near side of the river, Mata Ae'io behind it on the other side of the river, and Pukekakariki about 400 yards behind Mata Ae'io. The ground around these pa was full of ravines and thick with fern, meaning that they couldn't possibly be bypassed or surrounded safely, and the colonial force would have to force their way through all 3 to continue their raid. On the 11th, British soldiers advanced to within 250 yards of Orongumai Hangai, but instead of charging the pa as the British had done every battle up to this point, they began digging a trench and placed gabions, baskets filled with stones or earth to protect the soldiers. From this position, the 8-inch gun began firing on the pa, while the soldiers began digging a sap towards the pa. This is a trench dug towards the fortifications, so that attacking soldiers can get very close to the defences while remaining safe from gunfire. At first, the defenders did not seem to know what was happening or how to react. Lieutenant Colonel Carey wrote, "The enemy had offered no opposition. Seeing our advance, they had apparently been expecting the usual rush, for which they were quite prepared by firing their volleys and escaping unseen down the ravines. It was not until 10 a.m. that they fired a shot, but from this time and until near dawn on the 12th, a continuous and well-directed fire was kept up on the working parties in the trenches. By dawn on the 12th, the sap was very close to the pa when the firing from the defenders suddenly stopped. Shortly after, the British attacked both Orongomai and Mataiao and found them abandoned. Pukekaliki was also unoccupied, and all 3 pa were destroyed. Pukekaliki was described by W.I. Grayling as being surrounded by potato fields, but the colonial forces were not able to raid into Taranaki territory. Soon after they left New Plymouth, reports had come in saying that about 700 Ngāti Maniapoto and Waikato would soon arrive at Waitara, and neither Waitara or the New Plymouth garrison could be certain of victory if Te Atiawa and Ngāti Maniapoto attacked together. This Waikato contingent included about 80 Ngāti Hawa, led by Te Wetini Taipurutu, who you may recall as being the king's secretary, while Ipiha Tokuhihi returned to Waitara accompanied by Rewe Maniapoto and a strong force drawn from most of the Waikato iwi and even Ngāti Raukawa. Ngāti Hawa marched on ahead of the rest of the Maori forces. Many of the Ngāti Hawa warriors seemed to think they had something to prove, since Wiremu Tamihana, their most famous leader, was a pacifist. They marched faster and longer than the rest of the Waikato forces, and arrived at Kairau well in advance of the rest of the force. Here, Te Wetini discussed strategy with Hapuronu. Te Wetini wanted to quickly go on the offensive, while Hapuronu was more cautious. Te Wetini soon grew impatient and led a force of about 150 warriors to occupy Mahuitahi. Hapuronu specifically warned him against this position, and Te Atiawa took no part in this battle. Some accounts have Hapuronu and a force of about 100 warriors nearby watching the battle, but not offering any assistance. There were a number of reasons that Mahuitahi was a poor location for Te Wetini to fight a battle on. Mahuitahi was an old pa in a poor state of repair and not properly entrenched, located on some low hills and swampy ground. This swampy ground was beside the main road between Waitara and New Plymouth, and was therefore easily accessible by the colonial forces, and was surrounded by open ground, meaning that Te Wetini would not be able to withdraw from the swamp if the fighting turned against him. Also, there was no strategic significance to holding this location. While it blocked land travel between Waitara and the Bell Block Stockade, this was not hugely detrimental to the colonial forces, since Waitara could be easily supplied by sea, and these 2 fortifications could still communicate by signal lights. On the night of the 5th of November, Te Wetini occupied Mahuitahi, and while the bulk of his force began improving the fortifications, a few warriors were placed as skirmishers to provide warning of any colonial movements. However, the government forces quickly learnt of Te Wetini's location, and by midnight, Pratt had sent orders to a number of units to prepare for an early morning attack. 620 soldiers and 2 24-pounder howitzers set out from New Plymouth to attack this position, while 282 soldiers attacked from Waitara. At about 8 a.m. the New Plymouth force reached Mahuitahi, and the howitzers opened fire while the regular British troops advanced on the Maori skirmishers. The skirmishers fell back on the pa, but without the benefits of strong fortifications and heavily outnumbered, Te Wetini's force was not able to halt the British, who advanced into the pa. At this point, the Waitara force arrived from the other direction, meaning the artillery had to cease fire because they were likely to hit their own soldiers. But the Maori force was now in serious trouble. They were engaged in hand-to-hand combat across the swampy ground, outnumbered about 4 to 1, while militia and other forces were moving around the pa to cut off the retreat. Ngāti Hawa and their allies chose to run while that was still an option, although they left about a third of their force behind as killed, wounded or prisoners. They were pursued for 3 miles by the British soldiers, who only gave up the pursuit when they had reached the forest. 31 Maori were killed in this battle, including Te Wetini, and 7 prisoners were taken, most of them badly wounded, and 3 of them would die of their wounds before reaching New Plymouth. Against this, 4 of the colonial forces were killed and 15 wounded. Later, the Taranaki Herald reported that another 11 dead Maori were found in the swamp over the next few days, and this figure of 45 total dead is repeated in a few sources. Whether the truth is 34 or 45 dead, this was clearly a significant tactical victory for the colonial government, but it did little to alter the strategic situation. Te Atiawa remained intact and Ngāti Hawa took the brunt of the casualties. But this was an incursion onto government-held territory, so the government did not gain more land, nor deny any resources to Te Atiawa. While this battle was the deadliest in the war so far, its lack of strategic significance compared to the battles of Waireka and Puketakiere is obvious. After Waireka, Taranaki and Ngāti Rurunui were driven well back into their own territory, and the government forces were able to occupy Te Tairomaka. After Puketakiere, the Maori forces were able to rage much closer to New Plymouth, retook Te Tairomaka, and threatened taking Waireka. After Mohuitahi, everything carried on as much as it had in September and October. Another reason the government couldn't capitalise on this victory was that it was immediately followed by an order to send 400 British soldiers to Auckland to defend against a potential Waikato attack. Pratt ordered another redoubt to be built on the site of Mohuitahi, and with its forces depleted through having yet another fort to garrison, and those sent to Auckland, the government forces were forced to remain on the defensive until the situation in Auckland calmed down. Tensions in Auckland had risen drastically in October when Eliata, a Ngāti Tamaoho man, was shot near Patumahui. There were immediate concerns that he might have been murdered by a Pākehā. Eliata had been out hunting wild cattle with a larger group, but had continued chasing the fleeing animals alone after everyone else got tired of the pursuit. They had later heard a shot, but were not concerned until Eliata failed to come home that night. 4 days later they found his body in an area of bush that had been cleared by local Pākehā. A bullet had passed through his fan and entered his chest. Many of the people of Patumahui suspected a Pākehā man they had seen near the area of committing murder, and some wanted to attack neighbouring farms in retaliation. However, the following day Archdeacon Mansell calmed the situation and helped organise an inquiry into the death led by Ihaka Willie Takanini and Donald McLean. The investigation was publicly witnessed by a group of 150 or 200 Maori, and ultimately found that there was no reason to suspect foul play, and it was most likely that Eliata had tripped while running and had been killed by an accidental discharge from his own gun. However, this was not the end of the matter. While the Maori of Patumahui seems to have been largely content with this outcome, others were not. On the 23rd of October, a group of around 100 armed Maori advanced on Ihaka's home village of Pukaki, suspecting that he had helped cover up a murder in order to preserve peace in the Auckland region. Ihaka met the opposing side outside of Pukaki, and after haka the two sides spoke of the investigation. John Rogan of the Native Department wrote a summary of the meeting for Donald McLean. After a war dance, a number of fiery speeches were made by the Tawa, which were replied to with great effect by Ihaka's people. The object apparently sought to be obtained was to have the European who was suspected by the natives brought forward again for re-examination, and in the event of his being found guilty, to hand him over to them. Ihaka was blamed for having brought the matter to a conclusion so hurriedly with yourself at Patumahui, without first appealing to the natives generally and obtaining their consent. To this Ihaka ironically replied that they, of course, knew the whole circumstances of the case better than he did. They were a long distance off and saw nothing. He only took the trouble to investigate the matter on the ground, and of course he could not be expected to have arrived at a conclusion so just as theirs. After the speeches, the two sides joined together in a feast, and then the visitors left seemingly satisfied in the conduct of the investigation. Unfortunately, a few days later Ihaka was assaulted by 2 Pākehā men. I haven't been able to find much details of the attack or its causes, but it did undo a lot of the work that Ihaka had been doing to ease tensions in the region. But the Kingitanga was coming north to get involved in the investigation of the death of Eliata. A large group, estimated to be between 300 and 400 strong, and including a large group of Ngāti Hawa, the new King Tawhio, and the Kingmaker William Tamihana, were rowing down the Waikato River to confirm for themselves that Eliata had not been murdered. It was this expedition that led to a small panic in Auckland. Settlers at the south of Auckland left their homes for the safety of Auckland, while Gore Brown called out the militia in Otahuhu to defend the settlement, and requested 400 soldiers from Taranaki province to defend the capital. Ihaka went to the governor and informed Gore Brown that Wiremu Tamihana and Tamati Napora had promised him the expedition would be peaceful. Gore Brown decided to trust him and ordered the Otahuhu militia to return home. At Paitai, the expedition paused and a letter reached them from Ihaka, saying that he had investigated the death and there was no reason to suspect it was murder. Tawhio decided this should be sufficient and spoke in favour of returning home confident that justice had been done. However, and what must have been a challenge to Tawhio's authority, the bulk of the expedition decided to continue north, leaving King Tawhio and his mother behind. At Tuakau, they were met by a large group including the Bishop Selwyn. While discussions were ongoing, a small group of Maoris snuck off and continued north, but Tamihana sent after them when he became aware that they had left, and this group returned to Tuakau, and eventually the Kingitanga expedition was convinced to go home. Back in Taranaki, both sides spent November and most of December on the defensive. The government forces maintained their position while the Maori forces built up their strength. A number of hui were held to coordinate the summer's actions while more and more Kingitanga warriors arrived. Efforts were also made to secure more allies, particularly successfully along the Upper Wanganui River. As the months went on, Maori forces again started going on the offensive, burning houses near the Bell Block while Ngāti Ruanui and Taranaki again started approaching the government fort on Waireka. At Waitara, work was begun on a pa at Matariko, just over a kilometre from the redoubt on the site of Puketakiere. Over the course of December, the government forces were gradually strengthened, so that by the end of December the government could again go on the offensive. On the 29th of December, Pratt led a force of 1,004 men and 4 artillery pieces to attack Matariko. He used the same tactic that had been so successful on the Kaihihi River many months before. The soldiers advanced to 800 yards from the Matariko pa and began work on creating a redoubt. After a few hours, gunfire broke out and continued all day, although at that range it did not delay the construction of the colonial defences, which were completed by nightfall. The gunfire continued throughout the night, and a group of Maori did advance towards the redoubt, but seeing that they were spotted, decided not to attack the government position. The next day there was no firing as a white flag was flying over Matariko. The Maori did not want to fight on a Sunday, although the government strengthened their positions in preparation for more fighting. On the morning of the 31st, a missionary rode to Matariko pa and found it abandoned. The government occupied this incredibly strong position that the Maori forces had been fortifying for more than a month, for the loss of 3 dead and 22 wounded. This was a significant achievement for the colonial forces. Lieutenant Colonel Carey wrote that, "Had we stormed it, we might and should have taken it in a few hours, but with heavy loss to ourselves and scarcely any to the enemy, for he would have slipped unseen into the ravine when his position in the pa became untenable, and this he would have counted as a victory." During this engagement, the colonial forces fired 70,000 rounds of small arms ammunition and 120 artillery rounds. I think it most likely that the evacuation of Matariko and the earlier evacuations on the Kaihihi River were the result of Maori not being able to sustain this level of firepower. At Matariko, the Waikato warriors in particular were reported as having run out of ammunition since they had not carried much with them. Wiremu Kingi had 100 pouches of ammunition brought up to Matariko to allow them to continue fighting, before they eventually withdrew. However, Matariko was only an advanced post. Behind this pa at Huirangi there was a second line of defences, an almost continuous line of rifle pits in the forest across a front of more than a kilometre, with strong pa providing strong points in the defensive line. Pratt ordered a redoubt built on the site of Matariko, and for a few weeks the two sides faced off within a short distance of each other. The first few weeks of 1861 were spent by both sides preparing for the upcoming battle. The Maori spent their time strengthening their rifle pits and stockpiling more food and ammunition, while the government forces brought up more supplies and used their artillery to try and disrupt the Maori efforts. However, the artillery seems to have been particularly ineffective, with a large number of shells failing to explode. This standoff ended on the 14th when Pratt sent a strong force to construct a new redoubt about 500 yards forward of their current position. This redoubt, called Number 2, was quickly finished behind a line of skirmishers and continuous artillery fire on the Maori line. 120 soldiers were left to garrison this position. 4 days later, this exercise was repeated in the construction of No. 3 redoubt, 400 yards further forward and much larger, designed for a garrison of 300. At this point, the government forces began construction of a sap in the direction of the Maori line. In response, the Maori decided to go on an offensive. On the night of the 22nd, a Maori force of around 140, led by Rewi Maniapoto, E Piha Tokuhihi, and Hapuruna, crept up close to No. 3 redoubt. They were heavily outnumbered by the defenders, but were under the impression that the redoubt was poorly garrisoned. At redoubts 1 and 2, the sentries made a habit of periodically calling out an all clear to confirm that they hadn't been secretly killed. However, at No. 3 the sentries had stopped this practice, since when they did, the Maori had responded by firing a volley at where the voices came from. Hearing that there were a lot fewer sentries yelling out in the night, the Maori assumed that the redoubt must have been weakly held or abandoned. Half an hour before dawn, another group of Maori opened fire on all 3 of the redoubts, while the group of 140 rushed into the ditches around No. 3. However, they were not able to get into the redoubt. The defenders quickly manned the walls, and the slope up to the walls was too steep to climb easily. However, things were not too bad for the Maori force at this time. They attacked 2 points of the redoubt which were not enfiladed, meaning that the defenders could not fire into the ditch without leaning over the wall. A number were killed when they exposed themselves, and one even fell over the wall and into the ditch. The colonial forces were largely firing blindly into the trench, but a few soldiers threw explosive shells. The attackers cut foot and handholds into the side of the ditch and began to climb the walls, at times grabbing onto the bayonets and rifle barrels of the defenders to haul themselves up, but they were not able to get inside the redoubt before dawn. As dawn broke, the assault was doomed. A light 9-pounder howitzer opened fire, landing a number of explosive shells into the ditch around No. 3, while 230 infantry from the 65th and 12th Regiments advanced to assist the defenders of No. 3 redoubt. The attackers were now in a perilous position. If they stayed where they were, they would have to fight off this reinforcing force while under artillery fire and the risk of attack from the redoubt. However, if they withdrew, they would be exposed to accurate fire from the redoubt's defenders before they could escape. They held their position long enough to fire a short-range volley at the attacking soldiers before running for the forest. In this they got lucky. The soldiers of the 65th and 12th chased after the fleeing Maori warriors, but while failing to catch them, they blocked the fire of the defenders of No. 3 redoubt. Despite this final piece of luck, the attack on No. 3 was a costly defeat. At least 36 Maori were killed and a number were taken prisoner or wounded. By comparison, the government forces had only 5 killed and 12 wounded. The attack on No. 3 redoubt was a costly failure. It delayed the progress of the sap by a single day. At Matarikaliko, the Maori forces had learnt that long-range gunnery could not prevent British sapping and was costly in terms of ammunition, while No. 3 redoubt demonstrated that the government fortifications were as formidable as their own, and attacking them would be costly. Another strategy would have to be discovered, but while Hapuruna developed new tactics, the sap advanced. This was what was called a double sap, the form of trench used in the final stages before a siege assault. The soldiers digging the sap forward were protected from gunfire by sap rollers, large shields on wheels being pushed in front of them. To the sides they were protected by gabions, baskets of stones placed on the side of the trench to prevent gunfire into the trench. They dug a zigzag every few metres so that a bullet or shrapnel couldn't travel in a straight line, killing or wounding a number of soldiers, and to protect the soldiers from above, a wooden roof was constructed above them. Perhaps because of all these measures, the sap advanced slowly, about 67 yards a day. On the 27th, No. 4 redoubt was built, with No. 5 being built a few days later on the 29th. This redoubt was small, built for only 100 men, but was only 250 yards from the Maori front line. The Maori continued to fire from the defensives, but this was ineffective. In fact, after the Battle of No. 3 redoubt, there were no casualties on either sides for a long time. On the 4th of February, the sap reached the front line of the Maori defences, and the government began work on a large No. 6 redoubt, designed for 450 soldiers and 3 artillery pieces. With this redoubt being built on top of their defences, Te Atiawa and their allies were compelled to withdraw to a third line of defences around the pa of Pukerangiore and Te Are. Again, the two forces faced off for a time while preparing for their next action. While this fighting was happening at Waitara, Taranaki and Ngāti Rurunui had been putting pressure on the government forces at Omata. They had retaken Waireka Hill and built a series of 10 pa to block any advance by government forces to the west. However, Pratt was focused on the fighting at the Waitara River, and the fighting around Omata was limited to patrols and skirmishes, although it did lead to a few casualties on both sides. Most notable was the death of Captain William King, a militia officer who had recently been elected to Parliament as the representative of the Grey and Bell electorate. A by-election was held and Harry Atkinson was elected. He was another militia captain and a future Premier of New Zealand. On the 10th of February, the government forces again started advancing on the Maori defences at Te Are. They advanced to within 800 yards of the defences and constructed Redoubt No. 7. This redoubt was not as well placed as the previous ones and could be fired into from Maori positions above it. One soldier was killed in its construction, and the government spent 4 days building the walls high enough to provide sufficient protection. However, on the 14th, another sap started towards the Maori fortifications. The defenders had a new strategy. They fired on the soldiers digging the sap from positions where the soldiers and artillery in Redoubt 7 could not effectively fire back. This forced the government to send soldiers well out into the ferns to try and drive Maori away from the sap. Both sides took casualties, but the Maori generally had the better of these skirmishes, although they were not sufficient to halt the sap. On the 26th of February, Haparona led a raid on the sap. They succeeded in taking away the sap rollers and setting a number of gabions on fire and destroying 100 yards of trench before they withdrew to their own lines. This raid delayed the sap by 3 days and led to the construction of No. 8 redoubt to protect the sap, but it eventually continued on. On the 5th of March, the sap was again attacked. This time the Maori launched a feint attack on the right side of the sap, but as the defenders turned to the right to defend against this threat, a second group of Maori hidden in the trench only 25 yards away to the left fired into their backs. Despite these casualties, the sap continued forward, although from now on they dug the trench even deeper, slowing progress. However, by the 9th, the Maori were beginning construction of a 4th line of defences behind Te Are. This slow sapping offensive was securing a lot of territory for the government, but did not seem any closer to bringing the government a victory. 2 days later, the sap was still 200 yards from Te Are, but Wiremu Tamihana had arrived at Waitara, and he was about to dramatically change the course of the war. Tamihana was acknowledged as the kingmaker of the Kingitanga movement and a well-known pacifist. He had remained aloof from the fighting, but had finally decided to head to the conflict zone to try and bring about peace. There had been earlier attempts by the King movement to make peace with the government, but these had been shot down by the governor. The first of these was with Thomas Smith, the Assistant Native Secretary, in January. Smith was approached for a meeting by Tamati Napora and Parata. Napora was Tawhio's uncle and the Kingitanga's representative in Auckland. The meeting at Mangere went on for a number of hours, but there was little progress. Napora stated that peace couldn't be made if the government demanded the land at Waitara and punishment for the murders of March 1860. Taranaki and Ngāti Ruanui would not offer compensation for these killings since they had occurred in a war that the government had declared. Te Ātiawa would not allow their land to be taken from them. Furthermore, Te Ātiawa would be obliged to defend Taranaki and Ngāti Ruanui if the governor demanded compensation since they had come to the aid of Te Ātiawa. In the same manner, if the government tried to take land from Te Ātiawa, the Kingitanga would be obliged to come to their defence since they had accepted the king's flag. Peace could not be made unless the governor gave up on these goals. Smith replied by saying that peace would be difficult if the king's flag still flew. Napora's response was direct. It was replied that the natives had not looked at the Maori king question as standing in the way of peace, that they did not assume that it would by itself be made a ground of quarrel, that if this was the governor's intentions, it should be made known that they might know what to prepare for, as if it were understood that the suppression of the Maori king and Maori independence would be insisted on. He believed it would close the door against peace, that to die in the struggle would be the resolution taken by the king's supporters, who would choose this rather than the shame which would attach to the submission of giving up their point. Gore Brown took this meeting as proof that peace could not be made, and that New Zealand would have to be conquered by force. He wrote to the Duke of Newcastle, "The love of independence and the patriotism of these men are entitled to our sympathy and respect, but they are not the less incompatible with the maintenance of the Queen's supremacy, which is quite as indispensable to the happiness and well-being of the Maoris as it is to that of the Europeans. Collision would be inevitable between the two races inhabiting one country, but acknowledging two sovereigns and claiming to be governed by laws antagonistic to each other it is needless to say which race would ultimately prevail. So peace was not likely. Despite this, there was a second larger meeting on the 5th of February. Tamati Napora led a large Maori delegation, including Ihaka Takanini Ahipeni from Waiuku, as well as representatives from as far as Ngāti Toa and Ngāpui. The government side was led by Gore Brown and included the Attorney General Frederick Whitaker, Donald Maclean, Thomas Smith, and Francis Bell, whom the Bell Block was named after. After everyone had arrived at Government House, Ahipeni took the lead by proposing what the Maori wanted for peace. First, the piece of land at Waitara, let it be left aside or set apart to be afterwards arranged or settled by a court of wakawakanga. Second, do not hold or bear remembrances the cause of evil, whether as regards men, the land, or murder or property, let these all be unloosened. All forgiven now at the present time. So, straightforward, Maori wanted an investigation into the land dealings at Waitara, and to forgive everyone their part in the war. But this was not sufficient for Gore Brown. For instance, there was not a word about the future recognition of British law in cases where individuals of the two races were concerned, nor about compensation for the devastation that had been committed at Taranaki, nor about the murder of the boys at Aumata in March 1860. Waikato had gone down to Taranaki without a cause. Where was the grounds on which they had taken up arms against the Queen? Were they to expect, after joining in an insurrection, spilling so much blood and utterly desolating an English settlement, to have an unconditional peace, which would leave them at liberty to renew hostilities when they pleased? There was a lot more discussion, but the meeting did not move beyond this point. Napora told the governor that he could unilaterally declare the fighting at an end. If Wiremu Kingi chose to let it continue, then everyone would know Kingi was to blame for the fighting. Gore Brown needed confidence in a permanent peace and pointed out that Waikato was not under attack. It was very easy for the Waikato iwi to stop their own blood from being shed. Napora responded by comparing Waikato and Te Atiawa to the governor's stick. A strike on one end would cause the whole stick to vibrate. Gore Brown replied that it was the same vibrations that had reached the Queen in England. Eventually the meeting dispersed, failing to reach any kind of agreement. However, on the Pākehā side there were concerns about the future of the war. After this meeting, Gore Brown set off to the Bay of Islands, where he found that Ngāpui, an iwi he considered an ally, was growing disaffected, and a few prominent members were openly talking about joining with Te Atiawa in order to prevent the governor's ambition to take all Maori land. At the same time, Donald Maclean was writing his thoughts on the feelings amongst Maoridom. He was not optimistic. All of the Waikato was opposed to the government. A few iwi near the major settlements were neutral because of their close relationship with the Europeans, while a few inland iwi were neutral because they had limited contact with Europeans. But the government had no reliable allies among Maori, and the longer the war went on, the more likely the war was to expand out of Taranaki. He wrote of talk of an attack from Waikato on Auckland, and less serious talk of a general attack on all European settlements. Maori recognised that they could not win in open battle, but thought that if they kept attacking isolated farms and people, eventually the French would join the war, and the British would be forced to leave. Donald Maclean ended his analysis with some strong words. This much, however, is certain, that the English settlements in New Zealand are at present in a more dangerous and precarious state than they have been at any period since the foundations of the colony. After reading this, the new Native Affairs Minister, Frederick Weld, concluded that this danger was largely the result of a lack of British military victory in Taranaki and a resulting disdain for the power of the government. Shortly after the failure of these attempts to talk the governor into making peace, Wiremu Tamihana decided to head to Taranaki to convince Wiremu Kingi to make peace. First he went from Tamahili to Taupo to get the assistance of Iwi Kaotuhihu in this endeavour. After this detour they arrived at Pukerangiora on the 11th of March. Tamihana's first action was to open communications with General Pratt. "Sir, Commander of the Forces, salutations to you. I have a word to say to you. Let me have these 3 days, Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, to give me an opportunity of looking at your enemies, that is to say, the Maoris of Waikato and your friend the Rangatake, that I may see how it is with them. It is for you to approve of this good suggestion. If you agree, then write to your soldiers to cease building their breastworks, and do nothing during the coming 3 days. Pratt responded, "Your letter has reached me. As far as I can see, the words in your letter are not clear. Some of your thoughts are absent. If such continues to be the case, I will not accept your letters in future. Speak out your thoughts that I may understand. It was you that asked for these 3 days' truce. This day is ended, and I will agree to give you 2 days. He added a second note. When you see my letter, hoist flags at all the Maori places, leave the trenches and go stay in the pa's and keep the white flags flying. Tamihana then crossed the Waitara River and went into the defences at Te Are. However, the next morning this truce was broken. Tamihana had a white flag placed on the palisade of the pa to signal that the truce was in effect. However, the British did not notice, and they continued to shell the pa and sent out skirmishers to protect the work on the saps. Tamihana again wrote to Pratt. But I know this. You have been crafty towards me. Your soldiers came today within the breastworks and fired. Now I know, in the first place, you are a crafty man, and secondly, that you are a man without power among your people. Enough. The firing soon ceased, and Pratt responded by blaming Tamihana for not putting the white flag in a more visible position. Tamihana then turned his attention to discussion with the defenders of Te Are. After 2 days, he managed to get the leaders of the Te Atiawa and the Kingitanga to agree that Tamihana could represent them. According to Gorst's second-hand account, Wirumu Kingi symbolically gifted Tamihana the disputed land at Waitara, making this conflict Tamihana's concern and not Kingi's. Most accounts have a more straightforward process of Tamihana convincing Kingi to give peace a chance. Either way, 2 days later, Tamihana had the Maori leaders supporting him, other than Ngāti Ruanui and Taranaki, as they were not present. Tamihana wrote to Pratt expressing his plan for peace. The cause of my holding these 2 days is that I might make known my kōrero to the general. On this day I spoke my words to them. The cause of my coming here was to put an end to the war. I made my words openly known to them, and they unanimously agreed to what I said. The cause of that word of mine was the governor's words that the Maori must make peace. I came, therefore, to Te Rangatake, to the head of my party. This was his word. The Maoris must make peace. This was Te Rangatake's word to me. Yes, when Waitara comes back to me, then only will I make peace. And the soldiers also must go back to Waitoki. Let the Waikatos go back to Waikato, to Rangatake to stay on the parts which have been fought upon, and leave Waitara open in the care of the law. This is why it should be left to the care of the law, that we may wait for a word from the head of the great runanga of the Queen. If she says we are to dive, we will dive, and if she says we are to rise to the surface, we will rise. The Queen's Great Council was a reference to the Parliament in London. Tamihana believed that if the Queen sent an investigator to specifically look at this land dispute, the investigation would be fair and able to be accepted by everyone. Until this investigation, the Waitara block was to be unoccupied and would act as a buffer between Te Atiawa and government soldiers. Of course, Pratt didn't agree. His response began with, "The proposals of William King are inadmissible." But he did offer a counter-proposal. Let the Waikato return to his own country, and William King to Matai Tawa and remain there. The Queen's troops will occupy Te Are and Pukerangiora for the present. Let William Thompson proceed in a man-of-war steamer to Auckland accompanied by Mr. Hay, and treat in person with the Governor, who alone can decide on the matter of peace. The Mr. Hay in question was Drummond Hay, a land purchase commissioner and surveyor, who was the person tasked with passing these messages back and forth between Tamihana and Pratt. Tamihana was not keen on travelling on a British ship to Auckland. He recalled that Te Rauparaha had been captured while being a friend of the Governor, and was not keen to trust Gore Brown. But the truce was extended by 1 more day. By the end of the 15th, no more progress had been made. Tamihana had proposed instead that he and the Governor could meet at Tuakau, but Pratt was not willing to accept anything less than Tamihana travelling to Auckland on a British warship. Tamihana suggested that the Governor could come to Taranaki. Again, this was not sufficient. On the morning of the 16th, Tamihana still had the white flag firing, but since no truce had been agreed, the British began shelling the defences and restarted work on the sap. Tamihana allowed the warriors to return fire, although he did not take part. The fighting over the next few days was some of the most intense of the sapping campaign. By the 18th, the sap was within 90 yards of the Maori defences, and the Taranaki Herald reported that the pa was expected to be taken that night. However, both sides had taken losses reaching this point. The previous night, Maori had attempted a repeat raid on the saphead, but the soldiers had laid traps. They had broken glass bottles around the saphead and placed a heavy artillery shell on the sap rollers, so that they would explode if they were moved. The sound of people walking on broken glass and the explosion of the shell alerted the government forces, and they responded with heavy gunfire. During the day, though, Maori marksmen were able to wound or kill some of the soldiers working in the sap. On the 18th, Donald Maclean arrived at New Plymouth to talk with Tamihana. Gore Brown had wanted to come, but he had been talked out of it by the government ministers. He shouldn't seem too eager for peace. Maclean had the proposed attack postponed and raised a white flag to allow him to meet with Tamihana. The discussions of the 19th followed the same pattern as between the general and Tamihana, with the exception that Maclean was more willing to let British authority determine the ownership of land at Waitara, but Tamihana would still have to go to Auckland to confirm this with the governor. Tamihana would not agree, but said that he would wait for a month or two for the governor to come to him and make peace. However, overnight he changed his mind. On the morning of the 20th, the defenders of Tiare and Pukerangiora started leaving. Tamihana led all of the Kingitanga forces back to the Waikato, and had ordered the Ngāti Raukawa and Whanganui to go home, and Te Atiawa to leave the trenches and return to their villages. The defences were abandoned, and that night Donald Maclean slept inside the Maori pā. However, as Lieutenant Colonel Carey wrote, to occupy the pā, now that the enemy had retired, was useless, and in the native opinion would be considered unfair. Essentially, the war was over at Waitara because the Maori had decided not to fight anymore. Around Omata and Wairika, though, Taranaki and Ngāti Ruanui were not part of this, and the 20th of March was noted for being a particularly productive day in terms of raiding parties stealing livestock and burning farms, although there were so few farms left standing that some groups turned to destroying fences. However, the next day the positions around Wairika were also abandoned, and Taranaki fell back onto Tairamaka. The military leaders of both sides had essentially created a peace in Taranaki by refusing to fight. In the next episode we will start with the political leadership trying to make this a permanent peace.